Welcome. My name is Glenn Diesen. I'm a professor here at the University of Southeastern Norway. With me is the excellent Alexander Mercouris. Last but not least, Ray McGovern. So Ray McGovern was a CIA analyst for 27 years. He headed the CIA branch analyzing Moscow's foreign policy in the 70s. From 1981 to 85, he presented then in person the morning briefings of the president's daily brief, that is presenting the daily briefs to President Ronald Reagan over a period of 4 years. And Ray McGovern was then awarded the Intelligence Commendation Medal at his retirement. However, interestingly enough, returning this medal back in protest of the CIA torture. And in January of 2003, McGovern co-founded the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity to warn the US president that the intelligence he was receiving on Iraq was fraudulent. And McGovern therefore warned against the invasion of Iraq. Unfortunately, did not go on, his warnings were not heeded. And McGovern has since been very outspoken about the fraudulent evidence in this entire Russiagate affair, which we will speak about today. And he has also been a prominent voice in challenging Washington's narrative about this war in Ukraine. So again, pardon my French, but this is a hell of a CV. So welcome, Ray McGovern. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Glenn. Your French is almost as perfect as your English. My compliments.
well, as a heavyweight from the U.S. intelligence community on both Russia and China, I would add, this is a great opportunity for us to get some insight into the information, but also the disinformation, I guess, that shaped the public perceptions about this very dangerous conflict, which only seems to escalate. So that's why today I was hoping we can discuss some of this relationship of U.S. intelligence with the media, academia, think tanks, and other ways of shaping or manipulating public perceptions. So I thought we could start off talking a bit about Russiagate, which really destroyed what remained of U.S.-Russian relations, and then we can move over more to the current war in Ukraine. So let's just jump straight into it. In fact, today an op-ed came out written by yourself. So you wrote an op-ed today of 5th of December 2022 that the vast majority of Americans still believe that Russia hacked the DNC emails in 2016 to secure this election victory for Donald Trump. And this continues to shape the views of Russia in the United States as well. Now, you argue that most of the evidence in this case actually prove otherwise. That the Russiagate was not Russian hacking. I was hoping perhaps you can explain.
Sure, Glenn. It's a long, sad story. Let me try to be brief here. This is December 5th, 2022. On December 5th, 2017, 5 years ago, the head of CrowdStrike, a cybersecurity firm, testified before the House Intelligence Committee. And when he was put under oath and asked, "Is there technical evidence from your inspection of the DNC servers and computers that Russia hacked into the DNC emails?" he said, "No, there is no technical evidence showing that." By way of background, the DNC emails in 2016 showed how Hillary Clinton and the DNC had stacked the deck against rival Bernie Sanders to the point where he had no chance to become the nominee. So it was very embarrassing. It was very embarrassing to Hillary Clinton, the more so since WikiLeaks published these emails 3 days before the Democratic convention in July. 2016. Now, the Hillary Clinton campaign decided, and we know this now from court testimony and from emails revealed preparatory to court testimony, that they decided to blame WikiLeaks, not only for publishing them, but to blame Russia for hacking into the DNC and giving those emails to WikiLeaks. Now, just as an important aside here, we in Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity have an array of justice and truth-speaking analysts that you could hardly believe these days. Two of them were former technical directors at the National Security Agency, all right, the NSA. They know NSA back and forth. They know how NSA's capabilities would allow NSA to intercept, to collect, to have any emails. Now, when I said to Bill Binney, the chief technical director that worked with us, I said, Bill, this is crazy. You can't collect all emails or telephone conferences. He says, look, Ray, trust me. I've been there. I helped devise the system. I didn't know it would be used this way, but we could do it, and we do it. Then Snowden came out with the diagrams, with the top secret charts. Suffice it to say that we knew early on, right after the election in 2016, that there could have been no hack by anyone, not Russia, but not anybody else, because of technical expertise, technical documentation. And we published on December 12th, 2016. It couldn't be a hack by Russia or anyone else. It was a leak. Somebody had access to the DNC computers, put a little thumb drive or other external storage device, and downloaded those things, put them in their pocket, took a plane over to wherever WikiLeaks published them. So it was a bum rap from the beginning. Why does this matter? Well, on the strength of this bum rap, Obama threw out 35 Russian diplomats, and Bob Mueller, the special counsel, indicted 12 GRU, Russian military security experts, for hacking the DNC. The Central Intelligence Agency wrote all kinds of memos saying, we assess that the Russians did it, we assess that they did. Now, it was a fraud, okay? Now, so that was back in 16 that we could already determine that. If you detect a note of chagrin in my voice here, we couldn't persuade anyone. I mean, when you have the principle of physics, when you have eminently trustworthy technical directors, when you have evidence from Ed Snowden, and when you have a reputation for reliability, people should be able to believe you, right? They did often back in the day when I worked for the CIA. No more. Not even our friends would believe us. So, long story short, we knew in December of 2016, we published on that. It's on the record. But we had to wait for a long time to get confirmation that we were right. Now, what did we wait for? Well, we didn't know it. But a year later, I'm talking December 5th, actually, 5 years ago, 2017, finally, they got the head of CrowdStrike, the cyber firm who investigated the email filching, under oath. When they asked him, as I said before, what's the evidence that the Russians hacked? He said, there's no technical evidence the Russians hacked. It's consistent with Russian practice, but consistent with other people's practice. So it was a lot of BS, as we say in the States. Now, what's the story here? Why should I make such a big deal? 5 years ago, for God's sake. Well, Americans don't know that the cornerstone for Russiagate and for the expulsion of Russian diplomats and for the indictment of these GRU people it all rests on this belief that Russia hacked into the DNC to help Trump win. Okay. Now, on the 5th of December, 5 years ago, Sean Henry said, no, I can't, under oath, I have to admit there's no technical evidence. What happened? Adam Schiff, the Democrat who headed the House Intelligence Committee and still does, he put that in a safe and he told, look, all you other people who are at that meeting, at that briefing, at that testimony, forget about it, forget about it. And so they forget about it for 2.5 years. Finally, Trump, who's, sort of a novice in the ways of Washington, says, I think I could probably get them to publish that. He's got a new national director for intelligence. The national intelligence director says, yeah, I'm going to go to Schiff and I'm going to say, look, you publish that testimony or I'm going to do it. I have the authority to do it. I'm going to do it tomorrow. What does Schiff do? He publishes it together with an array of other scarcely relevant documents. And then he tells his friends in the media, I was able to keep this secret for 2.5 years, namely that there's no basis for Russiagate. See what you guys can do. Now, I was aware on May 7th, 2020, okay, when this unclassified testimony was released. It was unclassified all along. And so I wrote about it right away. Did anybody read it? Well, I don't know. Maybe Alexandra did. Maybe you did, Glenn. Nobody else. So the rest of the story is this, that the New York Times and the major media put that in the same kind of safe that Schiff did. And up until today, 5 years later, 80% of the American people believe, according to an informal survey that I've done, that Russia hacked into the DNC, that Russia is in part responsible for Donald Trump. By God, what is something worse to blame something for? I'm revealing my prejudices here. But if you believe that Russia was in part, at least, responsible for us having 4 years of Trump, that's about as bad an accusation as you get. Most people believe that. Why? Because that testimony is still secret. And the eloquent article that I did yesterday will be out there in the ether. Some people will read it. I'm glad you did, Glenn. Maybe Alexander did as well. But, Americans don't have access to this kind of thing. And we are, of course, excluded from what they call the major media, the establishment media. So if you detect a note of frustration, well, it's consequential. And I'll just end with this. Why do I say the deception, the hoax is consequential? Well, because we've had 6 years now, 6 straight years of blackening Putin, making him out to be the new Hitler, making him worse than Satan and the Russian people as well, firing conductors and so forth. We've had 6 years of that. We're involved in a war with Russia right now by proxy. Americans are prepared because of this misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, really. They're prepared to support our government no matter what they do. And so if Joe Biden decides to heed the advice of his sophomoric advisors, say, well, we can beat Russia and Ukraine. There's real trouble ahead because Ukraine is not winning. Russia is winning. And, you don't have to be a military analyst like I did for 2 years to realize that you look at the map and you see who has what they call today escalation dominance. It's Russia. And Russia's going to finish Ukraine off. And the only way that Biden or anybody in the lily white West, we can talk about that later, NATO can prevent that would be to be threatening nuclear weapons. Now, Russia has not threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons. It has reminded everyone that it has nuclear weapons in a sort of secondhand way. We can use all the means at our disposal to prevent our loss in Ukraine. They won't have to. They have 200,000 more troops coming online. This winter is going to be horrific for the Ukrainian people. It should stop now. People should have a modicum of compassion to what the Ukrainian people are suffering. And Biden could end this by simply saying more than he did just yesterday or the day before. Yeah, I'm open to negotiations, but Putin's gotta come to terms on my terms. That's not going to do it. This is inexorable. And what I'm trying to say here is all this propaganda over the last 6 years, if I were Vladimir Putin, I would say, my God, the Western people, particularly the American people, are being prepared for war. This is the Goebbels thing. This is what George W. Bush called catapulting the propaganda before the attack on Iraq. So this is a very unhealthy situation, to put it mildly. The sooner some sane heads prevail, the better. But this is more than just a kind of an analytic find here. It's not any great brainstorm. All you do is you watch and you listen and you record and you remember, and then all of a sudden you remember, 5 years of being in the dark when that testimony was already available, unclassified, to the Democratic leadership in the House.
I'm just I'm trying to wrap my head around how there's no media coverage almost at all about this, because again I read this article by yourself and Binny from 2017 warning exactly what you're saying, that there was no hack. Even when everyone said it was a hack, there was there was no one on the other side effectively. And if someone did raise their voice, they would be dismissed as a Trumpist or a Trump voter. But it's just shocking because again, you were you have your long history from the CIA, Binny, the technical director in the NSA, and still didn't get that much attention. And not even this. I feel a lot of this evidence is is very solid. I think even declassified notes show that even back in July of 2016 was this notes about CIA Director John Brennan, his notes informing President Obama that Hillary Clinton was using false allegations to, as a quote, as a means of distracting the public from her use of private email servers. And also, he informed Obama that the Clinton aimed to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up, a scandal claiming interference by the Russian security service. So they kind of knew this even before the main Russiagate had really hit. And yes, sorry, Ray.
No, I just want to interrupt. Thank you for letting me interrupt. And number one, it was 2016 that we put out that memo. So it was a whole year before the testimony. The other thing is that when Brennan did what he did, it's not too arcane to explain. He was forced to do that because they intercepted some Russian chatter or Russian information where the Russians said these things, okay? Now, that was leaked to the press, okay? And so when a leak like that happens, the head of Central Intelligence is obliged by law to inform the Justice Department, and if it's important enough, to inform President Obama. And so that's why Brennan did. Now, when he told President Obama that, did Obama say, "Oh my God"? No, he said Obama was in this to his ankles from the very beginning. So he said, "Okay, John Brennan, you've warned me. You've gone through the paces here. So the Russians know about this too. What are we going to do?" So it was sort of a laughing sort of thing. And that's, the really disturbing thing. Brennan had a hold on Obama for reasons that I'll never really know. And Obama pretty much did what Brennan said. And when they went through the motions here, when they wanted to blame Russia for the hacking, it is established in court testimony now that even before this phony cyber firm reported back to the Justice Department or the FBI, Obama was insisting that his director of national intelligence and that his director of homeland security put out a memo saying the Russians hacked in October 2016. Now, they both were scandalized, but they did their duty. They did what was required. They put out this memo. And so it was Obama that was kind of way ahead of all these folks. And later we know that Hillary Clinton, also in court testimony by her campaign manager, approved this Alpha Bank hoax, where Alpha Bank was being used to communicate with Trump's associates and so forth. The technicians that worked on this technical evidence had to hold their nose. So the people are going to find us out in 1 week, for God's sake. That's okay. We'll go with it. That was October of 2016, right before the election. So you got Obama, you got Hillary Clinton. You're very quite right in saying the Russians knew it. Everyone knew it. Actually, what's his name? David Sanger from the New York Times published around this time that people were accusing Hillary of having done this on purpose. Well, she did do it on purpose, and it was a magnificent distraction from what the content of those emails were. And the content, as I think I mentioned before, revealed that Bernie Sanders had no chance to win the nomination, the way the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and the Clinton campaign had stacked the deck. So that was the abrasive thing. Obama and the head of the FBI at the time, James Comey, Obama's going out. Comey wants to stay, but Comey writes in his book, look, you have to understand, everyone in Washington thought it a done deal that Hillary was going to win the election. And so we allowed ourselves to do what was helpful to Hillary. And indeed, they did. So you had the law enforcement, you had the intelligence community, all helping Hillary because she's going to win. Is she going to pursue us in a justice kind of way for helping? She's not going to do that. So they were surprised as hell, like everyone was, when Trump won. And then they had to sort of cover up the whole thing and tried. They've done pretty well on the hacking, haven't they? 5 years, 6 years, really. So anyhow, if I get a little excited about this, it's because you bring out a really good point, Glenn. It's really hard for us intelligence analysts, non-political, okay? Truman set us up to give the president directly untainted, untreated is his word, untreated intelligence. Tell me like it is, okay? Don't get involved in domestic politics. Now, to see us do that job continuously, even in retirement, and have our former friends, our former colleagues who prostituted themselves in manufacturing weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, spurn us. No one come to us and say, you were right, sorry, sorry we got taken in on this. No, they were part of it. And that's what's really, really hard. And there are some of us some of my colleagues are very straightforward and good people, but the poison is Trump. Now, Trump was regarded as somebody just completely unacceptable. And it was sort of an emotional thing. Anything that can get Trump, we'll buy into, okay? And so you have people who are very decent people who would say, well, Ray, you're helping Trump. You're defending. What, are you in Trump's pocket? I have the last thing I'll say here. I have a little button here. I don't know if you can see it. It says, Putin verstehe. Can you see it? Putin verstehe. Okay. I got that 6-7 years ago in Germany. I do a lot of time in Germany. I spent 5 years there. And so I say, oh, this is interesting. This is somebody who understands Putin. And my colleague says, Ray, for God's sake, put that away. This is pejorative in the extreme. anybody who tries to understand Putin is in Putin's pocket. I said, um Gottes Willen. What have we come to here? It's a psychological thing. It's a thing that I can't hope to understand, but it's very real and it's very consequential, I'll say again.
Well, it is an interesting, because being on Russia has really been one of the most important components, which have, basing the national consensus on, and also a key component for achieving political legitimacy. So you always have these slogans that if you don't follow the party line, then you're, Putinist or Putin apologist. But I find the German one, the German slander, to be especially interesting. Exactly, Putin versteher, which is literally Putin understander, as if understanding your opponent is the height of insults. It is quite extraordinary.
Can I just say, because I mean, that's absolutely correct. I mean, what is an intelligence agency for ultimately? It is surely there to understand the other side. I mean, if it's not trying to do that, what is its purpose at the end of the day? I mean, it can collect data, but the whole point about an intelligence agency shouldn't be just to collect data. It should be to analyze it, what Ray used to do, and understand it, and explain it so that policymakers, and not just policymakers, can actually make proper decisions. If you're not out to understand your adversary, your opponent, then of course you're going to get things disastrously wrong. Can I just add a few things to what Ray said? A number of things. Firstly, I absolutely did read all the pieces that Ray has talked about, just as I've read his absolutely excellent piece, which you introduced. You were talking about, Glenn, which has just come out. I remember reading all of the analysis that Bill Binney and VIPS, by the way, is an outstanding organization, one of the great pillars of sanity in the world today, and God help us, we need them. Anyway, I read everything. I remember reading all the analyses of the hack, of the explanations of why it couldn't be a hack. I should say that I'd started as one of those people who thought that Russiagate was in two parts. There was a collusion allegation, an idea that Trump and the Russians were somehow working together. I never took that one seriously, but I thought perhaps just possibly there might have been something in the hack story. And Bill Binney and I gave this compelling explanation why it would not be the case, and VIPS did. And I found that very persuasive. And the media at the time wouldn't touch this. Russiagate was all over the British media at that time. You only have to go back, read The Guardian in those days. It was full of one story after another, anonymous officials briefing all over the place. And you have something done by VIPS, done by the technical director of the NSA. And it was like there was a sort of order, a kind of omerta, we must not mention it. And then I also remember reading all about Sean Henry's testimony when finally we learned about this. And this is the one instance when I think I can actually add something, because I wrote about that and I got Sean Henry's title wrong. I said he was the CEO of CrowdStrike, and then I got an email from CrowdStrike, and CrowdStrike said to me, we've read your piece, we've read it carefully. We just want to point out he isn't actually the CEO of CrowdStrike. He's actually the president of CrowdStrike. He's actually senior to being CEO. But they didn't say that he didn't say what he said to the Senate, or sorry, to the House. They didn't say that his words had been misunderstood or misrepresented, or that there was some confusion there. They didn't say that what VIPS was, what Ray was saying about what Sean Henry had said. They didn't suggest in any part of that email that that was wrong. So I don't usually like to take an argument from silence, but they contacted me. If they're, taking the whole rest of the article and saying that's fine. We're only concerned about the fact that you called him the CEO when he's actually the president. Well, I have to conclude that the whole testimony has been reported correctly by people like Ray. Now, when Ray says that Trump is the source of the poison, he is absolutely right. And again, I'm talking from Britain. Nothing, in my opinion, has turned liberal opinion in Britain, and I'm sure this is true in the United States as well, and elsewhere probably in Europe, more against the Russians, crystallized, hardened feeling against the Russians, than this belief that the Russians were in some way responsible for the election of Donald Trump. Now, I have to say, Donald Trump, not the person I would vote for. But having said that, I've always wondered quite why people feel as strongly about Trump as they do. Well, people have their right to their feelings, no doubt, but the Russians are not responsible for Donald Trump. Most people I know still think they are. And I cannot overstate how strong that feeling is and how much damage it's done. And the fact that there's never been a reckoning, there's never been an explanation about, in the media about how the whole Russiagate story has collapsed. That unfortunately means that that poison persists to this day.
I guess I'm just surprised how all of these issues tend to, always become an issue of Russia. So, for example, with the original Russiagate scandal, again, this was a leak demonstrating that Clinton had and the DNC had essentially, frauded the Democratic Party by sidelining Bernie Sanders. And then instead of being an internal dispute within the Democratic Party or a conflict between Democrats and the Republicans, they were able to flip it to effectively being all about Russia, even though all the evidence showed that Russia was not involved in this. And it didn't stop there. So remember with the next election in 2020, you had all this debate over Afghanistan, and yet again, they kind of identified where's the weak spot in Trump's armor. Oh, well, we can't call him a Russian agent. So now they began to say, the Russians have put, these bounties on the heads of American soldiers, which was kind of obvious nonsense from day one. And yet again, Russia became the target of this domestic polarization and dispute within the American political system. And then you saw another component of Russiagate, if you will, which was this Biden laptop story, which also emerged before the 2020 election. This also triggered this immediate return to the Russiagate formula, thus shifting focus away from the laptop, and instead it became all about Russian interference. And again, for those not remembering it, this is Hunter Biden, the son of the then presidential candidate. He left his laptop at the computer repair store for more than 90 days. So according to the law, they transferred ownership to the owner of the store. And after discovering the material, he contacted the FBI, and without hearing anything, he gave it to Rudy Giuliani, who was the mayor of New York, and then leaked it to the New York Post, which published a story. So at no point in time was there any place for Russia to play even a role. I mean, there was not even any theory in place in which Russia could be behind it. It didn't make any really sense. And yet you had 50 former intelligence officials signed a letter to support this theory that it was a big Russian disinformation operation, which I find astonishing. But so again, domestic issues all become, pointing towards this, this external boogeyman. And I find it interesting because this is the story of the week, isn't it? Now that Twitter is under the rule of Elon Musk, he's given this file, I think, to Matt Taibbi, who's now written a piece essentially showing that the Democratic Party was in contact with Twitter, telling them who to censor, who to get rid of from the platform, and also to protect them. And again, it's just it's not. It sounds like a wild Hollywood movie about a conspiracy, but this is now evidence. The Democratic Party talked to Twitter. You have the intelligence community jumping in, providing the support. The media going along. It's just it's quite extraordinary. I can almost believe. I can understand why many people well, that doesn't want to believe their own eyes and ears that this is that this was concocted effectively. It's yeah, sorry, Ray.
No, Glenn, you're quite right. I mean, it wouldn't pass Hollywood. It's just too strange and too hard to believe. Take 2020, for example. There was interference before the election. My God, was there interference. All the things about Hunter Biden's laptop. Now, we knew that about 4 or 5 weeks before the election, okay? You explained what happened. New York Post was taken off, Twitter, YouTube. They were completely blackened out from the social media. And so was the president. I mean, so was Trump. Okay. Now I'm thinking here, this really smells. Biden gets an interview with Stephanopoulos. He went to Columbia, by the way. He's one of those Ivy League guys, right? So Stephanopoulos takes him all through this public interview with some people asking questions. Never once mentioned. Nobody's allowed to mention the laptop, okay? Now, here's a true confession by Ray McGovern. I caught so much heat from my immediate family, as well as all my friends, for being in Putin's pocket, that the notion that Trump might win in 2020, and then it might be because McGovern published about Hunter Biden's laptop as real. Oh my God, I couldn't do that. And so I didn't do what I should have done. I didn't do what Glenn Greenwald almost solitarily did. I didn't publish anything on this, even though it all seemed very real to me. It did check out even then. Now, as you point out, they have chapter and verse in these emails. Who's running this all? The social media kingpins, mostly Democratic retirees or Democratic retirees from intelligence services, the censors, who before the election censors the president himself, the New York Post, anybody else who wants to talk about this. So it's both Democrats and Republicans. But in this recent thing, if you want to talk about election interference, it's a proven fact that the Democratic Party leaned on these social media people to act in an irresponsible way for the key weeks before the election. The election was not, was close enough to say, well, this probably may have had an effect. And lastly, but not least, rounding up 51 former senior intelligence officials. Well, who did that? John Brennan did that. His PR person collected all these people, and among them were some very senior friends of mine. One who prevented a war against Iran, for God's sake, ran an estimate saying Iran is not working on a nuclear weapon. Pulled the rug right under Cheney and Bush. No attack on Iraq, despite what Israel wants. Same guy. I don't know why. Maybe just so he'd be invited to lunch with Condoleezza Rice from time to time. He signed that damn thing. Now, if you look at the thing closely, it says we have no evidence of this, but it's consistent with the Russian practice and, the disinformation. It's consistent. Give me a break. So all I'm saying is the political system is completely corrupted now. And that includes, to my with great pain, I say, the intelligence community, which began being corrupted just before I left with Bobby Gates and Bill Casey, and the people they appointed into leadership positions, the malleable managers that I spoke of so much in the past. They, in turn, have appointed more malleable managers. And now you have the CIA telling President Biden, the Russians are going to run out of ammunition. The Ukrainians are winning. I have an optimistic view. This is what the National Director of Intelligence told the press on, it was just Saturday, 2 days ago. So it's a pretty corrupt situation. What I'm trying to figure out is how how in God's name can we educate the American people? They're good people. You know, they just are terribly misinformed, and a lot of them poorly educated because of a lot of things. But they have to know before the balloon goes up and Biden says, "Oh, now we have to get involved more directly in this terrible attack by Russia on Ukraine." Now, lastly, that attack on Ukraine was not unprovoked. And anyone who says it was unprovoked would have to say that what John Kennedy did back in October of 1962, and I was on active duty then, okay? What he did in telling Khrushchev, look, you remove those missiles or we're going to attack Cuba or we're going to threaten nuclear war. Now, did anybody say to John Kennedy, wait a second, you're doing acts of war with that blockade and so forth. You're unprovoked. No, he was provoked, for God's sake. And Khrushchev was smart enough to withdraw the missiles. Now Putin is being provoked in precisely the same way with these medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles going into these holes in Romania and Poland, the holes already there under a pretext of being ABM holes. They're not. They're holes that can house cruise missiles, and when the U.S. gets them, hypersonic missiles. Cruise missiles able to reach Moscow in 7 to 10 minutes. Hypersonic missiles, 5 minutes. Now, John Kennedy didn't want just 5 minutes to decide whether to blow up the rest of the world. Neither does Putin. So to say that Putin was unprovoked into trying to clean out Ukraine would be to say that John Kennedy was also unprovoked. No, major powers take care of their immediate surroundings, and they refuse to sit back and let themselves be put under this kind of danger. That's how I see Putin acting here. Nobody makes much of the fact that those missile sites are already installed in Poland and Romania, and that Putin himself has warned about them explicitly, to include the time from launch to target that he would have to contend with if they went ahead and put those missiles in. One last thing, which is really important, and I really appreciate both of your views on this. I feel like a lone ranger here. Let me explain. Back in December of last year, Putin and Biden talked early December, saying, okay, we'll have negotiators talk about all these problems, a place for Russia in the security situation in Europe, and we'll begin in Geneva on the 9th and 10th of January. Okay. 30th of December, the White House gets a call from the Kremlin. Mr. Putin would like to talk to Mr. Biden. Why? Our negotiators are going to meet in just 9 or 10 days. He wants to talk to Mr. Biden. He wants to talk to Mr. Biden now. Biden, to his credit, accepts the call. Okay. Now, what's the readout from that call? Very little, a zilch from the US. But the Soviet readout, the Russian readout says, Mr. Biden said that Washington has no intention of installing offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. Wow, that was great rejoicing in Moscow on New Year's and New Year's Eve even. And the negotiations seem to be off to a very good start. In other words, according to the Russian readout, Putin extracted from Biden a promise not to do in Ukraine what the US military was doing in Romania and Poland. And what happened? It fell into a crack. My guess is that Biden woke up the next morning and his advisors, Sullivan and Blinken and all those sophomores, said, you didn't really promise that, did you, Joe? Well, yeah. Well, I told Putin, well, forget about it, Joe, forget about it. And so the U.S. forgot about it. 6 weeks later, the next and last consultation, phone call between Putin and Biden, Russian readout, the subject of intermediate range ballistic missiles, what the Russians call offensive strike missiles, not to be put in Ukraine, was not discussed. In other words, it's fallen into the cracks. So why do I mention all this? Because that seems pretty important to me. I've been writing about it as often as I can, but I never get any reaction. And, you know, as my old Irish grandmother used to say, all my friends are dead all right now. They're dead now, you know. The people I used to depend on, they're dead or playing golf. Do you guys know? Do you think this is significant that on the 30th of December, Biden promised not to put offensive strike missiles of the kind that can reach Moscow in 5 to 10 minutes in Ukraine? Or do you think it's not so significant?
Well, can I just start with that? I think it's extremely significant. And of course, it also tracks very closely what Xi Jinping has been telling to Biden as well. Xi Jinping says, you come along, you have meetings with me. It's in the Chinese readouts. Chinese readouts, by the way, are awfully long and incredibly detailed. Anyway, Xi Jinping said to Biden in one of them, look, you come along, you tell me that you're going to abide by the one China policy, that you're not seeking to encourage secession by Taiwan, and then your administration goes away and does something completely different. And the trouble is, when you have that kind of thing, when the president of the United States comes along and gives what appear to be clear assurances, and those assurances are not honored, either because the president himself is being duplicitous, or far more plausibly in this case, because he isn't in control of his administration and is being, in effect, overruled by his own admirers and by his bureaucracy. Well, that inevitably must mean that the other side loses confidence and trust. And if you don't have trust, you cannot conduct a negotiation. A negotiation becomes absolutely impossible because you say to yourself, well, who are we negotiating with then? We can't talk to the president of the United States. How can we expect that we can ever achieve any kind of agreement at all? We're simply wasting our time. Whilst the negotiations are underway, the United States will just move purposefully forward, plant its nuclear weapons, and will be left with a fait accompli. So I think that is a major factor that actually destroyed trust. Now, I wanted to say a number of things, just going back to some of the things that Ray was talking about intelligence officers and the kind of things that they've been saying. Once upon a time, and I'm sure this is absolutely true in Ray's day, serving intelligence officers, as far as I was concerned, I used to follow the news, you know, going back all the way to the 80s, beyond, I used to follow the news very closely. Serving intelligence officers were invisible people. We never saw them in the media. We never heard about, 50 intelligence officers coming along and giving us a view about something. We never, when that memorandum that Ray was talking about came out in October 2016, in the run up to the election, I'd never seen in my life anything like that happen before. And I have to say this, when intelligence agencies start being used, manipulated and used in that way as part of political conflicts in a country, that is a very bad and dangerous thing indeed. It is far more dangerous to me than having someone like Donald Trump, idiot though he may be, elected president of the United States. I cannot stress this. Now, I was born in Greece in 1961. In 1967, there was a coup in my country. I remember at that time, because, one becomes politically very mature when that happens. Because my family were at the, receiving end of all of these events. We were on the wrong side of the coup, if you like. When you start to get situations where part of the security services of a state become involved in its political disputes, then I mean you are on a very, very bad track indeed. And obviously Greece, well, you frankly expected that in Greece in the 1960s, that it would happen in the United States of America. That I have to say, it still leaves me incredulous to this day. So I wanted to say that. I just wanted to say that about where we were about all of that. And I think that the politicians, because this clearly does come from the politicians, who have used their influence on the intelligence services to get them to operate in that way, have done immense damage to the institutions and structures of American democracy and of the political system, and they're directly responsible for many of the problems which we have now. So I wanted to say that, and I have to say again, when it comes to negotiations, these two things are connected with each other. If you have a situation where, as I said, there are forces that are so powerful that the president of the United States cannot control them. He can't come to the president of Russia or the president of China and say, right, this is what we have agreed. If he can't do that, because intelligence agencies may be under, all kinds, maybe serving all kinds of other agendas, and other agencies of the United States government may be serving all kinds of other agendas as well. Well, we are in a very bad place. And that, I think, explains to a great extent why we have now seen this whole collapse in the institutional structures, the framework of negotiations. How we get back from this point is going to be incredibly difficult, and it will need a lot of rethinking in the United States itself.
Well, I think what both, sorry, I'll let you Ray first.
No, all I could say is I say amen to all that you have said, Alexander. And it's a very painful experience for me to watch this, because in my day, that goes back to the early 60s, 50 years ago or 60 years ago, there was a separation between the operations people and the analysts, okay? And at least on Soviet affairs, Russian affairs, we could tell it like it was. We could tell President whomever that, look, the Russians are not 10 feet tall, like the Pentagon is saying. And, this cannot be negotiated like the State Department is saying. This is how we see it. Now, when Bill Casey came in under Reagan, it was very bizarre because he was an old, cold warrior. First thing he said at the first cabinet meeting in the Reagan administration, early February 1981, okay? And I have a friend who was there. He said, you could hardly understand, Casey. I found that my analysts of Russian affairs, you know what? They depend 80% for their information from magazines and newspapers and broadcasts. No spies. Well, hey, Mr. Casey, that's the way it's always been on Russia. It's been tough. But if you do media analysis, if you develop that discipline, you can come to really good conclusions. Every now and then, Mr. Casey, you can get an aerial photograph or you can get an intercept. But almost always, those simply seem to confirm what you're very reasoned to with respect to what the state of the world is. Now, I'll give you an example. My first portfolio was Sino-Soviet relations. It was a really active field because the troglodytes around Washington could never believe that there could be any differences between two communist nations, right? Okay. We were being taken in, right? And so we had well, what about these communist parties? They're being riffed by this. No, it doesn't matter, okay? So what do we have to do? Well, we had to wait for things like, 15 divisions, 15 motorized rifle divisions, the cream of the crop, on the Chinese border, on the Russian side of the Chinese border. What does that mean? Well, that doesn't prove anything. And besides, we found a MiG-19 on the apron of the Shenyang in China airframe factory. So we say, well, that's an airframe factory, right? Yeah. Well, maybe the Chinese are making a MiG-19. No, Chinese can never do that. It's the state of the art. They never can do that. Well, how do you know that? Well, there's snow on the roof. Huh? There's snow on the roof, you idiot analysts. That means that if airframes are being built, you have to have heat for the workers, and the snow will melt on the roof. Well, why can't we? So you guys are just being taken in. The Russians have given them the state-of-the-art MiG-19. So what happens? 3 years later, we get a Chinese defector, and we're briefing them, and we say, "Oh, you're from Shenyang, yeah? Where'd you work?" "I worked in the airframe factory." I said, "What was that like?" "Oh, it was awful. We had to read about wear about 5 overcoats. There was no heating in the damn thing, but we put out those damn MiG-19s. By God, we did." So this is the kind of thing we had to contend with. Suffice it to say that in those days, with Chinese irredenta, I mean, they were claiming 1.5 thousand square kilometers in Russian Siberia, with fighting across the riverine borders in the Amur and Ussuri rivers, with an ideological conflict that wouldn't quit. We were convinced that they would hate each other forever. We were wrong. We did say that when new leadership came in, they may see the advantages of not letting the U.S. play them off against each other, but we thought that was a remote possibility. After I stopped briefing Secretary of State Schultz, he asked me to come back when something big came and give him my take on it. So I did. About 3 years later, this would have been 87, 88. I said, "Mr. Schultz, looks like there's a warming in Russia-Chinese relationship. You should be aware of that, because this is big, right?" Suffice it to say that in those days, the annual trade turnover, Sino-Soviet, Russia, China, $200 million a year. What's it going to be next year? Alexander probably knows. 200 billion. You know, I don't do math real well, but I asked my mathematician son, I said, "Was it? That's 1,000 times, Dad. That's 1,000 times." So, you know, they're natural. I mean, all the resources, natural resources Russia had, all the needed. I mean, it's such a natural. And the common enemy, I mean, for God's sake, the common enemy, as they see it, the United States, makes no bones about saying in their strategic documents, we're going to get Russia first, and then when we get China, then, you know, hello. Putin himself has said, I don't know. I thought there might have been some sinister plan behind this, but making an enemy of both us, Russia, and China makes no sense. These guys are insane. He said that just a month ago. Well, he's right about that. As a matter of fact, you can quote me on this. Putin is right about a lot of things.
I remember I wrote a book in 2015 where I kind of made this argument that Russia was shifting its entire economic infrastructure from the west to the east in this Greater Eurasian Initiative. And I remember being told, no, it's that's just what the Russians want you to think. It's just a marriage of convenience to increase their own stock value in the West. And it's quite extraordinary, even though they were committing themselves to billions of dollars in new pipeline infrastructure. Like, none of it mattered. It was all the Russian playbook, as we're told. And that takes me back to what your comment before. You said, if there's no need for any evidence to substantiate, then you say, well, that's the pattern of the Russians. You know, this is the Russian playbook. This is the kind of phrases you use when there's no evidence, and you can use it for anything. I mean, when this Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, it's like, oh, well, that's the Russian playbook. So apparently there's a playbook out there where Russia invests billions of dollars to have economic income and political influence in Europe, and then they blow it up. This is the playbook, apparently. So it is funny. I just want to take one quick step back, because I thought it was interesting what Ray said about this, about Biden withdrawing from this commitment not to not to place these offensive weapons in Ukraine, and also Alexander, you mentioned the same with China, that China sees them as being very duplicit. They say one thing and does something else, and I think that a lot of the reason behind this is because it seems to me that NATO tends to pursue somewhat of a salami tactic. You make these gradual incremental changes, and which allows you to say one thing but do something else, because you maintain the rhetoric of peace, but you don't want to make any commitments into the future because you're having this slow incremental changes. So again, one of the problems we had in Europe was the absence of a European security architecture, one that provides security guarantee to Russia. Again, and if you see how NATO has developed, it's quite interesting, because again, in the early 90s, it wasn't that controversial to point out that expanding NATO would be considered threatening to Russia. This was, this would not raise any eyebrows, but yet you saw then this NATO first proposing this partnership for peace. It was supposed to be an alternative to NATO expansion. And instead, it became a preparation, essentially aligning the militaries, which then made it easier to expand. And same, when they first decided to expand, they provided these security guarantees to Russia, the Russia-NATO Founding Act of 1999, saying, we're not going to station any permanent troops in the new member states, so you can relax, Russia. And then, later on, we began to say, well, what is permanence? What is a substantial combat force? And began to make this a lawyering thing. And of course, now with the military bases, missile bases in Poland and Romania, we can say that this agreement, made nothing. And now, of course, you have this, can this basis be used for anything else? Because this is clearly not only missile defense. Well, I remember it wasn't back in 2006 or 2007, Lisa Rice, she made the argument that, we're just going to have 10 interceptor missiles. Russia is paranoid if it's opposed to 10 missiles. And then suddenly, within 3 or 4 years, they were talking about 500 missiles. So it's this gradual incremental expansion. But if you're planning to do this in the future, you don't want any security architecture which constrains you in the future. So I think it's Robert Gates also made this point at one point where he said, we actually wrote in his memoirs that we just keep kicking the can down on missile defense and these other things, just waiting until we can present the Russians with a new fait accompli. And this was new realities on the ground. And I think this is one of the reasons why we don't want any security deals with Russia, because that prevents this flexible development towards Russia. And again, it's not pointing at the Americans only, because 4 days ago, Angela Merkel was interviewed in Spiegel, and she had some interesting things to say. I would recommend everyone to read this interview, because they were asking her, why didn't you offer Ukraine a set date to join NATO in 2008? And she said, they weren't really ready. We had to, the Russians, because she earlier said that Russia would see this as a declaration of war. So she said, it's necessary to prepare the Ukrainians first, build them up. And she said this was the same logic as the Minsk agreement. We had to do the Minsk agreement because we needed time to build up the Ukrainians, make them able to defend themselves. So from 2008, 2015, everything that seems like, we're going to take Russia's security concerns into interest, let's come up with a security agreement. She portrayed both of those events as simply an opportunity to buy time. Instead of finding a permanent peace with Russia, you're building up the forces, effectively not avoiding war, but preparing for a war from a favorable point of view. It's quite extraordinary. So it's just, for me, this seems like why you don't want to have a set peace agreement as of today, something that can constrain you in the future if you have no intention of actually pursuing one of mutual constraints and balance, and instead pursuing the security architecture based on the hegemony. But again, you would probably have, Ray, you would probably have some more thoughts on this.
No, I think you're right on target as usual, Glenn. You mentioned a protege of mine. His name is Robert Gates. he worked for me in the early 70s in my branch, the branch I ran on Soviet foreign policy. He was a maneuverable fellow, and when Bill Casey came in and looked for communists, for example, under the rocks in Nicaragua, and said, "Oh, Bobby, there's two communists," and Gates would say, "No, I see 5 there, Mr. Casey." He got the job of head of analysis, and he was my boss, really, when I was briefing Ronald Reagan's chief foreign policy advisors, Secretary of State Schultz, Secretary of Defense Weinberger, an array of national security advisors, the Vice President Bush, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So, for example, when I would be briefing Schultz, who is by far and away the best of them, okay? Solid. I get a little ticker. Young people don't know what ticker is. Comes in the AP wire, you rip it off, and Schultz's secretary gives it to me as I'm going in to see him, to brief him. And I say, "Oh, Mr. Schultz, you've been invited by Gorbachev to visit Moscow." He looks at it and says, "Oh." He looks at me and says, "I suppose your management up there in Langley would think this is a bad idea." I looked at him and I said, "Well, Secretary Schultz, you're aware that I don't always agree. Well, I seldom agree with my management on such matters." He smiles, okay? He was getting the straight poop from me via people I could trust, people who did media analysis like nobody else, people who knew that Gorbachev was the real deal when Casey and Gates were saying, no, he's just a clever commie, don't deal with him. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union will never give up power without a struggle and a lot of violence. Well, they were wrong. Now, did they ever pay any price for that? No. Gates became head of the CIA later, and then Secretary of Defense, okay? Now, what did he write in his memoir, just mentioned? Well, he meant about the Russians. You know, it was never in my portfolio. It was never in my list to do, making the Russians feel secure or happy. That's not what my business was all about. So Gates was one of the founding fathers, so to speak, of the emplacement of strategic missiles in the center of Europe after Trump got out of the INF treaty. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that way back when, in the early 70s, when I was running this branch, there were the SALT negotiations, strategic arms limitation talks. I seconded Gates to be one of the 3 people I had rotating with the delegation, with the military experts, and reporting from headquarters to the people in Washington. Gates made quite a name for himself and met a lot of people there. But the point is that in those days, we were telling the truth. And when Kissinger and Nixon came to us and said, you know, what about the Soviets and the Chinese? We said, they are afraid. What are they afraid of? They are afraid that the other is going to steal a march on them. And when you set up the visit to Beijing for the president in January of 1972, they are really afraid. They've come around on key issues like the quadripartite agreement on Berlin, for God's sake, and other flexibility we've never seen before. And this suggests to us there's an added element that they're serious about arms control. So go ahead with the SALT. They did. Now, what happened? They came to an agreement where they could fix it up such that there would be such limitations on defensive missiles that neither side could calculate that they could make an offensive first strike and escape immediate retaliation. Okay. And then they said to us, Kissinger, all right, will the Soviets cheat? Yeah, probably. how soon will we know when they cheat? Well, we went back to the experts that run the satellites and all that stuff. About 10 days, sir. 10 days. You sure? Pretty sure. Okay. Well, they went ahead. So it was trust, but verify. Doverai, no proverai. Okay. Then, before Nixon, before Reagan, this is Nixon and Kissinger. Okay. Did the Russians cheat? Yeah, they cheat. They cheated. And we found out that they were building this incredible radar in Krasnoyarsk, way the hell out in the middle of Siberia. It could only be an ABM radar. We called them on it. It took 6 years, but when Gorbachev came in, he said, all right. You showed us the pictures. It's an ABM radar. We're going to tear it down, okay? And they tore it down, again, before the Berlin Wall was torn down, okay? So if you negotiate these things, if you have a modicum of trust, built largely on the ability to verify, then progress can be made. Last thing about trust. There was an apogee, there was a high point in trust between Russia and the US back in 2013. Here was the situation. There was a false flag attack blamed on Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, sarin attack outside of Damascus. Secretary Kerry gets up and says, no fewer than 35 times in one interview and speech, it was Bashar al-Assad, it was Bashar al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad with a chemical attack. And we warned them that that's a red line. We have to go to war with Syria. Now, Obama, for all his faults, didn't want yet another war. So what happened? Well, he punted. He said, I think maybe we'll consult Congress. And the neocons said, no, you don't have to do that. He said, no, don't do that. And he said, yeah, I'm going to consult Congress. And then, by chance, he was scheduled to go up to St. Petersburg for an economic summit of some kind, and he met with Vladimir Putin. Now, Putin says to Obama, remember back in Lochern in Northern Ireland, remember we worked out that thing where we have a working group to how do we destroy Syrian chemical weapons? Yeah, I remember. Well, it's done. We've gotten the Syrians to agree to destroy all their extant chemical weapons, actually under UN supervision on a ship expressly outfitted to do that, like the ones you have. And Obama says, really? And Putin says, well, tune in tomorrow. The Syrian foreign minister is going to announce it. And he did. And Obama says, whoa, this pulls those chestnuts out of the fire. I don't have to start yet another offensive war. We were doing a covert war, but the offensive war, okay? Now, what happened? Kerry was cut out of this. He was in London traveling around soliciting support for war against Syria. And when they asked him 4 days later, that is 4 days after Putin and Obama agreed on this, what do you think the chances are that we could avoid war with Syria? Kerry said, and I quote, well, that would mean that they would have to destroy all their chemical weapons. They're not going to do that. That's not in the cards. Lesson here, Kerry was extremely distrusted by Putin, and he didn't have a chance to put the kibosh on this agreement. Putin pulled out Obama's chestnuts from the fire. They went ahead with the thing, and when Kerry got back to Washington, Obama said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, John, we agreed to do this. Go back to Geneva and finish the negotiations," and they did, and those weapons were destroyed. Bottom line, trust. September 12th, 2013, op-ed, New York Times, signed by Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. What does it say? It says, I welcome the new sense of trust that exists now, not only between our two countries, but between myself and President Obama. The only thing I object to, says Putin, writing this last paragraph, is the notion that there are exceptional countries in the world, like President Obama said just last week in that major speech. I don't think that's right. I think there are nations at various stages of development, some close to democracy, some are struggling. But when God looks down at nations, God considers them all equal. Period. End quote. I was informed at that time that Putin himself put his hand to that last paragraph. Confirmation came 3 years later when he's in an interview and he says precisely the same words spontaneously. Okay. So there's the rub here. No exceptional countries. Now, put yourself in the position of the neocons like Victoria Nuland. Now, we can't have trust between Russia and the US. 6 months later, so from September 2013, you get the coup on the Maidan in Kiev. Trust evaporates. Putin thinks he's been deceived by Obama. Putin's in Sochi finishing up the Winter Olympic. He comes back on the 23rd of February 2014 and says, okay, look, this looks very serious. First thing we have to do is figure out how we get Crimea back into Russia. And they do. Last little codicil to this is that a month after Crimea is annexed, all right, Putin gets up and he says, we had to do this. We had to annex Crimea. One factor was the fact that they could fall into Ukraine in NATO. But even more important was the prospect that there would be immediate and intermediate range ballistic missiles put on our border as they are already in Romania and Poland. Whoa! So we didn't want them put in Crimea as well. So right at the outset, he made it very clear. And so last thing I'll say on this is that, intelligence, you look at the Director of National Intelligence and she knows what Putin wants. He wants to control Ukraine. He wants to, he wants to take over the rest of Europe. Not she, but others say that. Okay, well, what does he say he wants? He wants to destroy the Ukrainian army and he wants to denazify the Ukrainian government. That's what he wants. And you could see the tactics that he has employed so far as very consonant with that. Now, geography dictates, and these sophisticated weapons like HIMARS dictate that geography moves Russian aims further westward. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's Lavrov saying explicitly, it's geography here. We can't stop with the Donbass now. You bring in HIMARS, we're going to go a little farther. Question in my mind is whether they'll go to Odessa. They can, but maybe you caught this, Alexander or Glenn. Maybe you caught this little mention of Odessa in that big speech, I think it was the 28th of October at Valdai. Here's Putin saying, Crimea, it could be a яблоко раздора. It could be an apple of discord, or it could be an apple to foster negotiations. I thought that was it came in answer to a question, but the question itself seemed quite canned. And so there was a little link. There's a little hint. Maybe, I don't know now, but there was something that Putin put out there, which if the U.S. has media analysts that read through these speeches and stay the 4 hours to watch these things, like I did and I still do, then they should have told President Biden, look, this is a little hint. Not only this, but one other thing, and that is Rose Gottemüller, who used to run arms control for the State Department, has dropped a broad hint in the Financial Times 2 months ago that we ought to start on these little problems and get dialogue going on the strategic issues that really bother Mr. Putin right off the bat. Sorry to be so long-winded here, but it's such a great chance to get to talk to people who know what I'm talking about, can understand it and agree or disagree as the case may be.
I did. Sorry, Glenn.
Oh no, just very brief. And I just want to say I thought was interesting this remark of Putin. I was at the Valdai meeting in Moscow in October when he made that point, and I thought it was interesting because I think the question came from a Greek journalist because he was arguing, I would like to visit maybe Odessa next year. Shall I apply for Ukrainian or Russian visa? So I thought that was a clever way of formulating it. But I thought the answer of Putin, it kind of reflected some of the logic of Moscow now, which is the longer this crisis or this conflict goes on, the more effectively Russia will seek in return, not just as a return on investment, if you will, but also if the conflict keeps escalating, then they will seek to impose a settlement in which they can feel secure in the future. So in other words, if there's no one to talk to in Moscow, and Kiev has passed a law that they're not even allowed to negotiate with Russia, then they will they will seek a settlement in which they can feel secure without anyone's consent, if you will, like impose their own settlement, and then that would to some extent entail going further and further west, including possibly Odessa. Which would be very horrible or destructive for the Ukrainian nation because, of course, they would be landlocked. But this has kind of been some of the logic all along because initially, after the West backed this coup in 2014, Russia kind of wanted to support Donbass aspiration in having autonomy, that is, be a part of the Ukrainian state, but have autonomy. But that then, this was rejected by sabotaging the Minsk agreement for 7 years, and then they say, okay, then we'll recognize the independence of Donbass, and then there was, and then the West got more and more involved in the war, and as it drags on, then they recognize these 4 regions, Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson as being Russian territories. And again, I think the longer this goes on, the more Russia would take. I mean, if it would be a settlement today, I think they could, in my opinion, they might even be willing to negotiate and give away some of the right bank of the Dnieper River. But that's just my guess or assumption based on what I've heard. But if it goes on if Russia has to impose its victory, if you will, I think yes, they would. It's a good chance they would go all the way to Odessa, and that's just on the western part. On the east, maybe even take Kharkov. So, sorry, Alexander, I interrupted you.
Wanted to say, and I think, because you're both making it, except I also agree, by the way, that the longer this goes on for, the less Ukraine there will be at the end. And it horrifies me, by the way, and this comes back to your point you were making earlier in the program, that people in the West don't seem to understand this, and they seem very indifferent to what is happening in Ukraine today. Now, we're all following the news. We see about what's happening in the battles in Donbass, the people who are dying, the conditions under which they're dying. We know about more missile strikes on Ukraine today. Every single day that passes of this war, there is less Ukraine, and people in Ukraine suffer and suffer horribly. But Glenn, Ray, coming back to all that you were saying, again, we're talking about trust. And 2 countries which post-World War II surely ought to know best how important a relationship with Moscow is, how important establishing some kind of trust-based dialogue with Moscow is, are Germany and the United States. The United States, because Russia remains the one country which has the potential to destroy the United States. It's the rival nuclear superpower. Germany, because, well, does one even have to explain it? And what we get instead, and coming back to your earlier point, Glenn, about salami tactics and about Merkel's, I thought, appalling interview for Der Spiegel, the utter cynicism with which we have treated the Russians. This idea that we can make promises to them, we can then break those promises, that, their opinions simply don't matter. We can go on doing this. We can have a situation where in 2013, we appear to have agreed with something between Obama and Putin about Syrian weapons, and then a few months later we pull a fast one in Kiev, and we assume that the Russians will just go on accepting this year after year after year, even as they're warning all the time, this isn't acceptable. I think it was Lavrov, I remember him saying at one point, we're getting tired of being lied to. That was what Lavrov, I think it was Lavrov said, but it was a very, very senior Russian. And you cannot conduct negotiations with the other side in that way. You can't lie to somebody, a country like Russia, or you shouldn't lie to countries, any countries actually, but certainly if you're going to start lying to a country, you certainly shouldn't be doing it to the Russians. Now, coming back to the Germans, there's this quote. I don't know if either of you have ever read Bismarck's memoirs, but I found it, and it says, do not expect that once taking advantage of Russia's weakness, you will receive dividends forever. Russians always come for their money, and when they come, do not rely on any agreements you have signed and which you're supposed to justify. They're not worth the paper they're written on. With the Russians, always play straight or do not play at all.
Wow.
Bismarck knew the Russians well. He spoke Russian. He'd been ambassador there. He had this understanding of, the fact that this is a country that takes negotiations, builds trust seriously. And Ray, can I just say, you were there at the conflict between the Chinese and the Russians. What we have now, and it's this terrible situation, is we have trust between the Chinese and the Russians. They do this treaty. They have this. There were these problems over the border. They set up a joint commission. They sort out all the problems about the border, which back in the 60s had seemed so intractable. They agree all these huge commercial agreements. They're able to do these things. Putin and Xi, they are able to talk. They know that what they say to each other, that will, translate into actual results. They don't have to worry all the time that, there'll be other people in their governments who will undermine any agreement. They don't worry that, the next Chinese leader or the next Russian leader will simply tear up whatever they've agreed. So they have trust. We don't have that trust anymore. We don't have it with the Russians. We're very close to losing it with the Chinese. And that is a diplomatic catastrophe. That is the most dangerous thing we could do if we start playing these countries false. And Ukraine is a disaster in itself, but it is also a huge warning of what might happen if we continue in this way.
Well, I think the reason why the Chinese are now getting more and more distrustful is the same salami tactics they kind of learned while watching Europe, because another example I left out was what happened with Yugoslavia, because after NATO invaded Yugoslavia without a UN mandate, they wanted a UN mandate for the occupation thereafter. And so in order to get this, they promised, yes, they put it in the Article 1061, I think, of the UN, that yes, we will not violate the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia and then Serbia. And this was in 1999. But then gradually, until 2008, just building the state structures, preparing it for secession, and then cutting it loose, saying, okay, now it's independent. So again, everything slowly. And I think the Chinese kind of worried about this because Washington keeps saying, yeah, no, we respect the one China policy. We're only going to have cultural and economic relations with Taiwan. However, we are going to set up more diplomatic ties. We want more representation for them in the UN. We're going to scrap all these restrictions on our politicians and diplomats traveling to Taiwan. But yes, we officially we're not supporting secessionists, and we still ascribe to this one China policy. And I think that the Chinese can see that they can see the writing on the wall. What we did to the Serbs. So I think. This kind of salami tactics, there can't be any trust if you think that all the rhetoric is just meant to calm down the adversary while you slowly chip away at the agreement. Sorry, Ray.
Now, I think you're really well advised to stress the trust angle. I'd like to kind of broaden it out a little bit now, and to weigh the implications of the fact that the Russians have learned that they can't trust us. I mentioned what Biden apparently promised on the 30th of December with respect to offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. But it goes much farther than that. Back 2015, for example, when the Russians came in and saved Bashar al-Assad from sure defeat at the hand of these ISIS-type people, there was a deal. Obama, to his credit, when Putin told him what was going to happen, said, okay, John Kerry, work out a deal with Lavrov and let's get a ceasefire, for God's sake. They got a ceasefire. 11 months of negotiations. How long did the ceasefire last? 7 days before the U.S. Air Force bombed the hell out of fixed Syrian positions that had been there for a year. Okay? So Putin goes to Valdai and he says, you know, we had an agreement. It was approved by me and by the President of the United States, and yet it was destroyed by the U.S. Air Force. I don't know what works here. I don't know if the American president really is in control of these things. So that's really important. Now, what has happened? I think that Lavrov and Putin decided once they were assured that this Sino-Russian alliance is more than just rhetoric, that you're having met some 28 times over the last couple of years, that Xi and Putin really do have a relationship that matters, okay? They decided, all right, forget about it. Peter the Great, you know, the window to Europe, отнюдь грозит, мы будем шведу, здесь будет город заложен, нас медом едному соседу, природа здесь нам суждено, в Европу прорубить окно, okay? They're going to beat it, not just break a window into Europe. They're going to, okay, well, that was 1700. And it worked pretty well. And Russians were mostly Europeans, their whole culture. It's a great loss to the West to have the Russians sort of say, well, look, you know, they're firing our conductors, they're banning our books, the Ukrainians, they're not letting children learn Russian. They're turning to the East. So they close the window down, okay, to the West. Now, what does that mean? Well, the U.S. is saying, well, we're isolating Russia, right? These sanctions, we're isolating. Give me a break. The world now is no longer unipolar. Most people are saying now it's multipolar, but I fancy a bipolar analogy here in both senses of the word, okay? Here, you have the lily white quest against China, India, Pakistan, Brazil, Argentina, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all these people of color. The Russians, well, a lot of those are of color, and the ones that are white have been blackened to the point where they're of color as well. So you have a minority, the lily white quest, against the rest of the world, really. That's why I say bipolar. Now, that's new. And that's a great loss to the West, not to the Russians. I mean, yeah, I happen to know something about Russia. And maybe I know a little bit more about what's being frittered away here by this stupid business about making sanctions against a country that's pretty autarkic, for God's sake, and able to sell its natural resources hither and yon. So what I'm saying here is this is very, very bloody and it's very, very dangerous. And when you have a racial component to this, let's face it, U.S. Was founded. We have a lot of racism going on in our country. And when we look, for example, at Vietnam, well, those were little black feet in the jungle, and they were going to contend with the U.S. Military, right? Westmoreland, our general, command in Saigon, after the war said, you know, the Oriental, they have a different perspective on life. Life is cheap in the Orient. He said that in an interview. I have the videotape. So there is this deep current of racial superiority. Maybe that's part of this exceptionalism business. And it's just such a waste because the Chinese have the right idea. If I read them correctly, and my Chinese analyst friends say I do, 4 millennia, and mostly kind of focused in on the 1.4 billion Chinese that are already taken out of poverty. What about that? They want to say, well, can't we just get along? Why does it have to be win-lose? Hey, let's try win-win. Well, I think that Russia is in that league now, and the question is whether U.S. policymakers will finally realize that it ain't working the way they had hoped it would work, that their domination is at an end, and that they can end this thing peacefully because the other side is not only more numerous, but more powerful now. The old equilateral triangle. Remember Russia, China, and the US, the triangle. Well, it's become sort of a isosceles triangle, if you will. There are two long arms, Russia and China, and the US is on the short end of this thing, okay? On the short end. And the sooner that our policymakers realize that, the better. And I hope it's sooner rather than later.
I completely agree. I mean, can I just say, I mean, I look back on the events of the last 30 years with great bitterness. I mean, I think that we've lost an extraordinary opportunity to build a stable and lasting and just peace. It was done for the most myopic and foolish reasons. I mean, one reads about, the sort of lost peace after the First World War. It seems that however critical one is of the statesmen at Versailles, we did a much worse job after the end of the Cold War. We took opportunities to build a real structure with the Russians, and I'm not talking here about, Western hegemony or anything of that kind. I'm talking about a peace in Europe which would have been lasting and which would have been in everybody's interests. And we've thrown it away because we pursued this policy of, playing the Russians, deceiving them, lying to them, doing the salami tactics that Glenn was talking about, thinking that we would win some kind of, I don't quite know what we thought we were winning, some kind of intricate chess game where we were never ultimately going to be in a position to play a kind of checkmate move. I mean, I don't even understand what the intended end point of all this was. I mean, if we ever do install these hypersonic missiles in Poland and Romania, which no doubt we will one day, well, what real actual benefit is that going to give us? I mean, is it supposed to frighten the Russians, intimidate them, make more concessions? Or is it going to make them try to look for defenses to hypersonic missiles and to deepen their relationship with the Chinese? And we've gone from a world where we could have had peace to the world where we once again have blocks. Because I completely agree with what Ray McGovern says. The Chinese and the Russians deny that they have a bloc. But it seems to me that that is to all intents and purposes what it has become. And we are making it so. And it's a very different bloc from the one that existed during the Cold War, the other side. Because, of course, firstly, we were much stronger than they were. I mean, Ray, you were the analyst at the time. You would know better than I do. I mean, we were much stronger and we were much more attractive to the rest of the world than they were. I mean, they had an ideology. Some people were drawn to it. There were all the national liberation movements and all of that. But ultimately, most people around the world, they didn't want to live like the Soviets. They wanted to live like the people did in the West. Well, we've got ourselves from a position where we were stronger before and we could have had a real peace, to a position now when we are weaker than we were before. And I'm thinking again also of what Ray was saying about the discussions at the time of the SALT I treaty, about how the Russians were becoming nervous, that because the United States might be opening up, to China, that there might be, moving forward with the Chinese, that the Russians suddenly were making concessions over Berlin and were making concessions over arms control. And that was an advantage that we had.
No.
Yeah. Just very soon. That was an advantage we had. We had this advantage that, well, in those days we could play off the two countries off against each other, and that gave us a position of strength. Now we made them into allies, so the pressure from the Russians to make concessions, and why would they make concessions given that they don't trust us? The pressure on the Russians to make concessions, like they did in 1971-72 over SALT I, has gone. And who destroyed the arms control architecture that was built up so laboriously over that time, and which was the underpinning of that long peace that we might have had? We did. We tore up the ABM treaty. We walked away from it. We've undermined the IMF treaty. Now, we pretend otherwise, but we did. Actually, we've blown to pieces the Open Sky Treaty, which President Eisenhower was proposing all the way back in the 50s. I'm sure Ray remembers all of that. And of course, now we've had a situation where the United States comes along to the Russians and said, well, let's talk about what we're going to do with the START Treaty. And the Russians say, we're not interested. We don't trust you. We don't believe that you have really good intentions anymore. So the whole structure of arms control is falling apart. So I look upon all of this with immense bitterness, and I worry about where we're going to get to and how we're going to end up. And I can't help but think that the ultimate end point, assuming we all get through this, which I'm confident we will, but it will be one in which the terms for the future are not going to be agreed consensually, but are going to be dictated to us and shaped by forces outside the West, in China, wherever, and that we will have to accept whatever place in the world is basically assigned to us. So I look upon all of this with great sorrow.
Well, it's an interesting shift of because often we focus on the shift of economic, like Russia shifting its technology, transportation corridors, financial instruments from the west to the east. But I thought what was that both of you pointed out with the Russians themselves, that after being told for 30 years now that we're building a Europe without them, that the Russians now are less than ever before not even identifying as European. And what one often thinks, maybe the older ones, but we always assume that the younger ones would grow up and want to become effectively Western. But we actually see that the trend is the younger Russians are less likely to consider themselves European. So it's not just the economic connectivity shifting, but it's even the identity. So I think this is important because it's this assumption often that we can, once this conflict is over, if we throw a carrot to the Russians, then they will go away from the Chinese because they, as Ray pointed out, they just they distrust each other so much that we can lure them away. But first of all, you're correct. They do trust the Chinese now to a great extent. They don't trust us, and which makes it forget about splitting them up. Even having basic arms control treaties and agreements now would be very, very difficult because of course you have trust but verify, but that only goes so far. And again, so the trust issue is really something both you, Ray, and Alexander pointed out. And I'm wondering why the trust has collapsed so much, and maybe that's changing pace a bit. If maybe Ray can shine some light on, because since the 8 days of Reagan, when you gave the briefings to Reagan every day, we see, for example, that think tanks have this new huge role in politics in the United States, and it's there's a lot of literature on this pointing out that they effectively have a business model which works against trust. That trust is a negative thing when because the main donor of think tanks are the weapons manufacturers, and well, the peace agreements are, and trust is actually bad for business. Just referred to one article by the New Yorker. It pointed out that Obama, he initially wanted to withdraw from Iraq, but then the Center for New American Security, which is a think tank, it became known as being the Obama's foreign policy think tank, and the report even suggested that that this think tank had essentially bought U.S. foreign policy, in which this one foreign policy think tank essentially took over a lot of the key position within the Obama administration, and this is kind of what think tanks are doing these days. I don't think people know how pervasive their influence is. They not only provide all of the research reports, but they also provide politicians who are out of office effectively a place to work and write research reports and remain relevant, and then they're sent back into the game once their party wins, and then they have people on the inside. And there's a lot, almost all the politicians are affiliated with think tanks, and all the think tanks are pretty much run by the same arms industry corporations. It's quite extraordinary, and I'm not sure, Ray, if you would have some insights how the think tanks themselves have changed politics, or at least diminished trust, because that seems to be at the heart of the problem, this lack of trust now in between the great powers.
Yes, well, thanks, Glenn. I coined an acronym. You'll recall that President Eisenhower, on his way out, warned Americans about the increased growth of the military-industrial complex. He wanted to say the military-industrial congressional complex, but his brother told him, Ike, you're going too far already. Well, that has grown like Topsy, okay? Now, the only thing that could prevent the accretion of power, wanted or not wanted, by the military-industrial complex, according to Ike, was a well-informed citizenry. We ain't got that now. We don't have a well-informed citizenry. The media is owned by the same people profiteering on the wars, for God's sake, all right? So the new acronym, instead of MIC, was the Mickey Mat. Now, I found out by writing that article yesterday that has made a dictionary. The Urban Dictionary has Mickey Mat, and it spells it out: the Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence, Media, Academia, Think Tank Complex. Mickey Mat sort of rhymes with Mickey Mouse. Remember it, okay? Why do I say media as if in all caps? Because the media is the linchpin. We started out talking about the media's role in constructing this Russiagate. It's really, really important. So what I'm saying here is that we have to contend with this with what liberty is left to us. Julian Assange tried and established what I call the fifth estate, the ether. Well, Julian has been stopped for the nonce, but the ether still exists. And my frustration is that I'm not smart enough, and I don't know anybody else who's smart enough to figure out how we can reach the rest of the American people. That's what's needed. A well-informed citizenry to put the brakes on these people who are making several thousand times as much as the normal worker in their factories. So it is the Mickey Mat. And, this lies at the bottom of a whole bunch of things, including what's happening in Ukraine. Billions and billions of dollars just pouring out there. Well, they're not pouring out there. They're going to the pockets of the billionaires that run the Mickey Mat. One little vignette. Yeah, I don't agree with everything Pope Francis said, but when he was here addressing a joint session of Congress in 2015, he got up and he said, the main problem in the world today is the blood-drenched arms traders. Those congressmen and senators got up, yeah. It was giving hypocrisy a bad name. And then they looked in their pockets for the last envelope from Lockheed and over here from Raytheon, and it was just so ugly to watch all that. Okay, that is the main problem. I don't know how we get at it, but we have to expose these people. I favor finding out where they live. Just kind of not do any violence, but just sort of say, hey, Americans, you're poor, you can't find a job. That's the guy that's responsible for it ultimately. The Mickey Mat. Thanks for the ability to advertise my sole contribution to the Urban Dictionary, Mickey Mat.
But it's just interesting because I think I remember in the 1970s, that was when this Operation Mockingbird was exposed, if I'm not mistaken, which was when the CIA was exposed for having infiltrated the media in order to influence how the news were reported. But these days, it feels like the intelligence community can just hide in plain sight. I mean, it was in 2017. I remember CNN, they hired both the former director of national intelligence, which is James Clapper, as an analyst for the network, and then they also hired former CIA director and NSA director Michael Hayden, also a security analyst for CNN. And then MSNBC and NBC, they hired CIA director John Brennan as a so effectively having the top of the intelligence community sitting there on TV, just feeding the the information to the viewers. And again, you have these others. You have the officials from former officials from FBI, the National Security Council, DEA, all of them essentially not taking work in the media. And you kind of have to ask, where's this clear dividing lines? Because now you see the media merging with intelligence communities. You see, think tanks merging with weapons manufacturers, and then taking over a lot of all this political influence. And it's just it begs the question, because when we began to talk, we talked about Russiagate, and I remember that special counsel John Duran, he indicted this Igor Danchenko, and because he had lied on many accounts to the FBI. Again, he was the main informant of this Steele dossier, which was full of holes, but he was like the main source, and he was also from this Brookings Institution and another think tank, and he had been kind of introduced to Steele at the Brookings Institute through another worker at the Brookings Institute, which was Fiona Hill. So she, and then she is, of course, one of this. She tends to be involved in both with Democratic Party and the think tanks, and so it kind of shows how this. They all come together effectively, and so you have the weapons manufacturers funding all of these think tanks. The think tanks are now, fueling this Russiagate, hoax, if you will, and it's just at some point this has to be called corruption, shouldn't it? I mean, this is not how the intelligence community was intended to work. It was supposed to be.
It's a corruption also of academic and other thought, because of course, think tanks are not in themselves a bad thing. Having people coming together and doing thinking and analyzing things, I mean, we need that. But of course, when we have all this money sloshing around and people coming up with these things, well, they don't become think tanks anymore. They become, well, I don't know what to describe them, lobbyists, propaganda outlets, hard intellectual guns. I mean, I don't know what they are any longer, but they have become part of a very, very ugly dangerous ecosystem, which I'm afraid has totally distorted the entire conversation. I'm guessing now, I mean, Washington has always been a complicated place. But I suspect when Ray started work back in the early 1960s, JFK was, I think, president then. Well, I think at that time it was a simpler place than it is today, and perhaps it was better for it. And can I just say, I'm glad you brought up the Steele dossier, because we have Ray with us. How is it ever possible that anybody in the intelligence community, in the FBI, in any part of the intelligence world, took that document seriously? I mean, I remember reading it. I'm not an intelligence person in any shape or form. I'm sure you had the same thing, Glenn. The moment I saw it, I said to myself, this is a fake. I mean, it has to be a fake. It's impossible it couldn't be true. And yet it circulated through the media. The FBI paying Dadchenko, apparently he was an informer. They were paying Steele as well. They clung to it. They conduct their entire investigation around it. Now, I mean, I have to say, I generally am one of these people who believes that things, don't explain something that can be, by more complicated reasoning when it can be explained by incompetence. But when I look at the Steele dossier, I do sometimes wonder.
Yeah. Well, if I may reply to that, it's a really good question. It wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate. It was only designed to last through the election when Hillary would win the election. They were all corrupt. The FBI, the CIA, they all knew about this. The corrupt journalists like Michael Isikoff and David Korn, they wrote a book about the dossier. Wow, this is the greatest thing that's since sliced bread. Now, well, they certainly lost their jobs. No, Korn is running one of these think tanks, and Isikoff is the investigative head of Yahoo News. Okay, so that's the rub of it. No one is ever held accountable. And my best story about this comes from Robert Parry, my mentor, the late Robert Parry, my mentor in journalism, at least. He told this story about the Columbia Journalism Review. The head of the op-ed page of the Washington Post was up there being quizzed by the students and all. And he was asked, well, you kept saying that weapons of mass destruction were a flat fact. His name was Fred Hyatt. Okay, Fred, how come you kept saying, 9 out of 10 editorials you put on that weapons of mass destruction was a flat fact? And you know what he said? He said, well, if it wasn't flat fact, then we probably shouldn't have said that. But Perry commented, yeah, Ray, it's sort of like a cardinal principle of journalism that if something's not so, you're not supposed to say it. It's now, did he get canned? No. He stayed as head of the op-ed page of Washington Post for 20 more years. He died last year. Okay. So the lack of accountability and the fact that these guys like Korn and Isikoff and Hyatt, if he were still alive, are still around, paying no price, even with the latest disclosures, which of course are not disclosures because the major medium is still sitting on the fact there was no Russian hack. Example number one. If you don't hold people accountable, well, that's what happens, and that has happened in spades in the intelligence. One little other thing you might not know about. Commentator on CNN, James Clapper, General Clapper, former head of the National Intelligence, supervising all intelligence agencies of the U.S. National Intelligence Community. Okay, he knows, he's a Russian expert. He has said publicly that there's something genetic, almost about genetic, that makes Russians be duplicitous, to make them evil, it's a genetic thing. Clapper saying that. Now, the other thing about Clapper, that not many people know. He's written a book. He's written a book as his experience in intelligence. And he talks about his role after Rumsfeld appointed him to head up imagery analysis. Here's a story. The CIA used to do imagery analysis. It was taken away from the CIA so it could be put under the Defense Department. General Clapper took over the National Imagery Interpretation Center. Okay, so before Iraq, where were those weapons of mass destruction? Well, in his book, Clapper says, well, you know, we were really pressured. We were pressured by Cheney and all of it to find. We identified 113 suspect sites, but we, you know, in the end analysis, and I take responsibility for this, says Clapper. We found things that weren't really there. We found things that really weren't there. He puts that in his book, for God's sake. I had a chance to confront him on that at a what was it, Carnegie Institute thing in November of 2018, and I said, "Now, you found things that weren't really there in Iraq. How about Russiagate? You know about NSA and what they can intercept. You worked at NSA. Is it possible that you found Russian hacking that wasn't really there?" Well, I got shouted down by the rest of the faithful at the Carnegie Institute. And who was shepherding this lecture? But the president of Carnegie at that time, his name is, he's now the head of the CIA. What's his name? Bill Burns. So he intervened and said, all right, well, that's enough, Mr. McGovern. Next question, please. But so here's the guy who was running an intelligence community, has this interesting take on what Russians are capable because of genetics, okay, and admits to having bent over so forward and taking responsibility for finding things, namely ABM, or not ABM, weapons of mass destruction, things that weren't really there. And now we know that he found at Obama's direction, he found Russian hacking that wasn't really there, but he's still not admitted to that. He's still a CNN commentator giving Americans the straight scoop. Lots of luck.
Do you have any final things you would like to ask Alexander? I just noticed we've held them right now for 2 hours.
Yeah, but I mean, it's been an extraordinarily enjoyable 2 hours, if I may say. Enjoyable, well, we're talking about very bleak subjects, I suppose. But can I just say, we have to find a way back. I mean, we've got ourselves into this awful situation. We have to start to find a way back. And the way to do it at the moment, there's two issues which I think are overriding. The first is Ukraine, obviously. And that means that we have to be honest with ourselves. I say we, I mean, Western governments, people who advise Western governments. Ukraine is not winning. Ukraine is being destroyed as we speak. It's a disaster for Europe. It's a disaster that the Russians have been antagonized and brought to this point, because, to be very clear, I completely agree with all that's been said previously, that the Russians were provoked, incredibly provoked to do this. And the cynicism of Merkel's interview with Der Spiegel shows the extent of that provocation, to my mind. But anyway, we've got to find a way to sort out the Ukrainian problem. It has to be part of a comprehensive resolution of the problems in Europe. It's the one thing which Macron has talked about, with which I agree, and maybe he has some sort of understanding about that. We've got to find a resolution. We've got to accept that because of this lack of trust that there is between us and the Russians, we may have to make concessions that we might not otherwise make. But that's what happens when you lie and deceive the other side all the time. So we may find, for example, going back to all that business about Odessa, that we might have to say, yes, Odessa can become, Ukrainian, stay Ukrainian, but that, the Russians might have some kind of presence there, for example, something we might not want. But anyway, we'll have to do that. So we will have to work to find a comprehensive solution to this problem in Ukraine. And then we've got to do something else. The Russians are very, very angry, clearly. They're not interested, for example, in talking about arms control. Arms control is essential. It is the absolute basis of the entire peace that we threw away after the end of the Cold War. And we have to try and reconstruct that again. And that means doing things like taking away those holes in the ground in Poland and Romania, which we say are going to have anti-ballistic missile systems, but which the Russians, I think quite rightly, fear may have other kind of systems as well. We have to work to get arms control going. And on the basis of those two things, maybe we can start to rebuild that quality of trust that is so desperately missing now. So that's what I wanted to say.
Well, it's worth noting that because Ray mentioned Ray McGovern before. No, sorry, mentioned William Burns before, the CIA director, because I think he's an interesting source on the question of whether or not Russia was provoked. Because a memo by William Burns from 2008, in February of 2008, he actually wrote that if the U.S. kept trying to pull Ukraine into NATO, and at that time, by the way, it's a very small minority of Ukrainians who actually wanted to be a part of NATO. Well, then he predicted there would be a civil war in Ukraine, and also that the Russians, like a good chance they would intervene either indirectly, which they did, and even directly in form of an invasion. And I thought it was interesting, this memo, because he pointed out that this is not something that the Russians would want to do. This would, be a horrible affair, but something they would feel pressure to do. Well, isn't this a nice description of a provocation? But again, you're not allowed to anymore, at least even in academia, not really allowed to reference this anymore. Because if you try to explain what Russia did, then immediately they say, oh, well, now you're legitimizing it. Now, and this is, of course, something you can't do. So
no, I need the monitor.
So I just think that this is the extraordinary part now in the discourse. There's no room for recognizing any security concern of Russia that might be legitimate. I mean, I never opened up a newspaper and actually read having the point of departure being this is Russian security concerns, and then assess, okay, well, how should we deal with it? Instead, it's always, Putin is very bad and they want to restore the Soviet Union, something that has nothing to do with us. And I think we just have to get it around our heads that recognizing Russian security concern is we're not doing Russia any favors. We have to recognize the security dilemma. If you continue to put missiles and troops along their border, they will react unfavorably in a way that undermines our security, or in this instance, leading to the destruction of Ukraine and all the horrific things that are happening there now. And I think a key part of this is, a key problem is actually the propaganda, which is behind kind of been the key theme through all this Russiagate and all the topics we discussed. Because a bit over a century ago, Walter Lippmann, the first, if you will, a scholar on the propaganda, he made this one point that propaganda has this excellent positive thing, which is it helps us to mobilize support, mobilize resources and public opinion, because you say it's a conflict between good and evil. It's great for mobilizing the population. However, he said the main weakness, the negative aspect, is it obstructs any workable peace, because once you define your opponent as pure evil, how can you compromise? How can you negotiate? This is appeasement, it's treason. And isn't that very similar to how we're talking today? If you say, well, let's sit down and talk to the Russians, or Trump said, it's not a bad thing to get along with Russia. Well, God, that's appeasement, that's treason. And this is where we are today. We can't talk about how the war began, and we can't talk about how getting an end to it as well, because any way of trying to end the war through diplomacy, well, wouldn't you know, it's also appeasement, and it might be treason as well. So it's this I think really that the propaganda is at the part of the problem here, that everything has to be good versus evil. And if you don't acknowledge this, then, well, you might just be part on the side of evil. So it's it's a difficult position to be in order to, you know, find your way out of this very difficult conflict where there's no more trust. So I'll give the last word to Ray, and then we'll let you go.
Well, I just want to say it's been a pleasure being on with you all. And Alexander, I get educated every day watching your roundup of what's going on in Ukraine, and I thank you sincerely for that. I thank you, Glenn, for your insights, not only today, but yesterday on Press TV. What I would say about Bill Burns is that not only did he record this in his memoir, but he was on the receiving end of a great admonition from Sergei Lavrov himself when Burns was our ambassador in Moscow. The date was the 1st of February, 2008. Lavrov called him in and he said, "Mr. Burns, do you know what "niet" means?" Oh, yeah. Well, "niet" means "niet," okay? If you include Ukraine in NATO, we will have to consider intervening in Ukraine. There will be civil war. "Niet" means "niet." Do you know what a red line is? Yes, I do. Burns played it straight. Title of his cable going back, and if I've seen one cable from Embassy Moscow, I've seen about 7,000. "Niet" means "niet," Moscow's red line on admission of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, okay? So now Burns is still around. I still have a modicum of hope that he will be an adult in the room here, but I'm also thinking that the impetus has to come from Europe now. I mean, just as Putin has given up on the West, I mean, I've sort of given up on the West as well. I don't see any enlightened people, except maybe Bill Burns, enabled to make the policy advances. What's got to happen, in my view, is Europe's got to feel what's really happening here. We have to make sure, and others, that they're educated enough to know that they've been had, okay? And that they can't act like a bunch of lemmings anymore, okay? There's that famous cartoon with the lemming hesitating going over the cliff, and he turns around to the next lemming and says, "Do we really have to do this?" And the other one says, "To do anything other than this is to violate the sacred trust of all the lemmings that have gone before us." Well, for God's sake, when you're freezing to death, when your industry is going back into the United States, if you can't act like an adult at that point, which the Germans dearly need to do, well, then I don't know. I don't understand human behavior. So it seems to me that the crucible is in Europe right now. It's wintertime. There's going to be an offensive in Ukraine. Won't the Europeans stand up and say, enough? That's it. We're done with this stuff. Or we're going to have to force some sort of resolution to this. We have to take into account Russia's security interests, its core interests, as China has its core interests, and the two of them together. We can't let this go on. So I'm hoping that I'm leaving it to you Europeans, Glenn, and the UK, if you, Alexander, if we call you guys Europeans, to push the buttons now and say, you know, we have to act like adults. We've got to tell the United States that their hegemony is over, that, you know, we need the gas, we need the oil, and we need to refurbish our own economies, because it isn't Russia that's suffering from these sanctions, it's us.
Yes. Well, on that note, we'll wrap it up. And yet again, I would like to thank Ray McGovern, but also, yes, Alexander Mercouris. Thanks again, and I hope we can do this again sometime in the future.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Glenn. And as I said, a massively informative program.
Thanks, Alexander.